Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. It's the first one of our series on our Wednesday Wisdom webinar, which is a bit of a mouthful to say. We're delighted to kick off with KCSIE and an update from Ollie Welsby from Brightcore. If you've not heard Ollie speak before, you are in for a treat. He manages to make KCSIE seem interesting, so I think that's a feat that not a lot of people can manage. And we've got a great series coming up. So I will hand over to Ollie in just 1 minute. The other thing to just say to you, here at the Independent Schools Portal, we have obviously got the series for senior leaders. We've also got one for marketeers, and we've also just brought one out for HR professionals, the first webinar of which will be about single central register next week. So please do have a look at those. All of those are completely free. We'd encourage you to come along to them. We've also got some market research evenings where we actually pay you for coming along, so they might be of interest too. So please do have a look at that on our website. But without further ado, I will hand over to the experts for the evening, and over to you, Ollie.
Thanks, Alicia, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you all this evening, even if it's on such a kind of traditionally dour topic as safeguarding in that regard. I'm going to share slides throughout the session, so I'll start by sharing a slide, and hopefully you'll all be able to see the title slide. If I can just click on that one there. Hopefully you can all now see that title slide. If the images of everybody else, if you just do a bit of screen admin, if the images of everybody else are in the way of the PowerPoint slides, there's a couple of settings you can play around with to move everybody. You can either take your mouse and hover around the top center edge of the screen and then click on that view options tab that appears and just click on side-by-side setting that gets everybody out of the way. Or you can, above the images of everybody else, click on the smallest of the icons there, which just puts the active speaker on, which means it'll just minimize the images just to one, which will be me currently because I'm the active speaker. So quite a few things just to talk to you about today. Obviously all related to keeping children safe in education and the things that we need to know from this year's update. So I think the first thing to emphasize is, what do we need to make sure that we got in place in each of our education settings as a result of this document and that's connected to this document. So the first thing is, we need to make sure that all colleagues have read and understood Keeping Children Safe Part 1 and Annex B. Well, almost all colleagues. Everyone who's got direct contact with children should be reading those two parts of the document. If you've got someone on your member of staff who doesn't come into contact with children, you can direct them to just read Annex A, which is the abbreviated version of Part 1. But the vast majority, if not all, of members of staff in most education settings will be reading Part 1 and Annex B. Not only do they need to read it, we need to make sure they've understood that document. Because from an inspection point of view, that's what inspectors want to check. Has this document been understood? Do people know the statutory requirements? Secondly, we need to make sure as a minimum that the rest of the senior team and any governors and trustees have also read Part 2 and Annex C as a minimum. Some of them may well need to read the whole document. Obviously, the safeguarding lead, safeguarding governor will need to, and any governors involved in recruitment, managing allegations will need to read Parts 3 and 4 as well. But as a minimum, the senior team, beyond the safeguarding team, and the governors need to read Part 2, the management of safeguarding, because it's going to affect their roles. And then also Annex C. Now, Annex C, as I'm sure you're aware, is the job description for a DSL. And we know within the document, Keeping Children Safe in Education, it clearly states that all governors have got strategic leadership responsibility for safeguarding, not just the safeguarding nominated governor, the whole board. So how can they effectively have strategic leadership responsibility and fulfill that role without, as a minimum, knowing what the DSL is supposed to be doing? So as a minimum, they need to read that Annex C as well. Thirdly, of course, you need to make sure your safeguarding and child protection policy is updated in line with Keeping Children Safe 24, and that your colleagues have both read and have got continual access to that updated version. Do they know it exists? Do they know what the updates are? Can they access that document whenever they've got a concern, if they need to check anything? And then fourthly, we also need to make sure that all of your colleagues have read your updated staff behaviour policy or code of conduct, whatever you call it in your setting, which should also include your whistleblowing and low-level concerns policies and procedures. Each of those documents will be updated annually. We know KCSIE has been. We know your safeguarding policies and staff behaviour policies need to be as well. and we need to make sure everyone has read and understood those documents. So let's focus on keeping children safe in education. As you know, there was a provisional version that was published in May, and this year we had on that front cover a statement of this document is provisional and will until the final version comes into force in September. And there was the expectation that quite a lot of changes would take place because a number of aspects were under review. As it turns out, the final version was published about 10:30 on Monday morning, and there's been minimal changes, just a few tiny technical changes, and certain sections are still technically under review, which I'll come to in a moment. So, part one, the safeguarding information for all staff who've got access to young people. Well, there's a lot in there. I'm not going to go through all of it. A lot of it hasn't changed from last year, but we know we've got sort of 22 pages in there that your colleagues need to be aware of, and you need to be aware of what they should know in terms of those statutory requirements. So it covers what they need to know. It covers some information about certain key topics, early help, in the cases of abuse and neglect, and so on, but not all of the key topics. The rest of the key topics and some further information on these ones is covered in Annex B. And therefore, it's really important that everyone also reads Annex B. Now, I know there is some confusion because in the early parts of Keeping Children Safe, it just says DSLs need to make sure everyone has got a copy and read part one. But actually, if you read it through, I think it's paragraph 41, might be 42, it does say additional information is found in Annex B, and all staff should read that part as well. So make sure they've had that, they've read that, they've understood that. And Annex B is the bit at the back, page 148 onwards. And again, just additional information that we just need to make sure they've got, they've read, they've understood. So I just want to focus just briefly on pages 7 and 8. Within those 2 pages, it does quite clearly set out the statutory requirements. And as DSLs, as school leaders, we need to make sure we're clear on exactly what that means for us. It talks about the training requirements. It talks about the induction arrangements and the induction requirements. It mentions, for example, that all staff should have an online safety update at least annually as well. So it's really important, first of all, that we're clear that we're meeting the statutory requirements for induction, for training that are set out on pages 7 and 8. It talks about safeguarding being everyone's responsibility. I'm going to come back to what that actually means in a few moments. We all say that phrase, not necessarily with a clear understanding in some settings, I feel. It goes through what safeguarding is, the difference between safeguarding and child protection, and the requirements to recognise and report concerns to the DSL or DDSL if they're not available. It goes through how to recognise and report those concerns, not only about a child, but also about colleagues, using your systems, what you need to do in terms of the school, local authority, children's social care, and so on. And then how to deal with a disclosure should one arise. And so we've got those statutory requirements that are in there, but the way that that is carried out in your setting, of course, is enshrined in your safeguarding and child protection policy, which is why staff need to read both. One is the statutory requirements. This is what the DfE want you to do and require and mandate you to do. And then your policy, this is how it works in this setting. So let's look at some of the key changes. It's often been talked about actually over the last few months, minimal technical changes this year, but actually it's quite important that we're clear on what those actually mean in reality for our colleagues and for ourselves. So part one, we've got to change to the definition of safeguarding this year, which is the first time for 4 years. The last change we had was a tiny tweak to include mental and physical in the prevention bit, and that was back in September 2020. But this year, we've seen quite a significant change to the definition of safeguarding to bring it in line with working together to safeguard children. We've got an updated list of early help indicators, and we're seeing increased reference now for the need to consider early help when children are experiencing suspensions, they're at risk of exclusion, and the attendance links. And I'm going to talk more about those shortly. We've got terminology changes. So it seems quite minor, just adding an additional word, but it means quite a significant amount, really, in terms of our colleagues' understanding. It says very clearly now throughout this document, wherever it says the phrase abuse and neglect, it also now says abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So we've got this expansion of this term. And it's really important we understand why that's gone in and really what that means in terms of training and understanding for our colleagues. We've got a technical change where it discusses domestic abuse, and that's to bring the document in line with the Domestic Abuse Act of 2021. And now it's very clearly in that document in Keeping Children Safe, that understanding that witnessing domestic abuse is a form of emotional abuse of children. So we know if children see or hear or experience the effects, even if they are not the physical recipients, that is a safeguarding concern, a child protection concern, and needs to be dealt with as such. And then we've got this increased focus on attendance, reference to unexplainable and or persistent absences from education, and the need to think about those from a safeguarding perspective. Now, this is quite a big change, and I'll explain where this has come from in a few moments. But historically, it's always been children missing education that is the safeguarding child protection category and concern. Whereas now, we're really focusing on those persistent absences. And is there a safeguarding incident going on? And as I said, I'll explain where that comes from. And again, another slightly, what seems like a technical change, but really important, paragraph 31 talks about it being important that when staff have got concerns about child-on-child abuse, that they should speak to their DSL rather than if they've got concerns. And therefore, the implication is that most of us are probably going to have a concern at some point. And when we think about that broad definition of child-on-child abuse, which can, of course, include bullying, physical abuse, it's not all just sexual abuse that sometimes it gets misunderstood to be. Actually, therefore, most of us probably will have a concern at least about bullying at some point in our professional careers. And therefore, when you've got a concern, you speak to the DSL rather than if. And then we've also got additional expansion around this exploitation side of things as well. And we've got the definition of criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation just being tweaked slightly to say that it may involve an exchange for something that a victim wants rather than it will involve. And that's because we know it doesn't always, and therefore it's important to reflect the reality in the document. As ever, we see a constant theme of online safety throughout this document. And the reason for that is very clear, isn't it? The online world is the world. Look at us doing this today. When you think about young people, most of their downtime, social activity has a digital element to it. I'm also just going to talk about part 5. So I'm going to skip part 2 for a moment. I'm going to come back to part 5. Well, I'll come back to part 2 later on, but in terms of part 5, the reason I'm mentioning it now is because it also talks about early help in that part as well. Now, as you know, part 5 is the section dealing with child-on-child abuse, sexual violence and sexual harassment. And it talks about in paragraph 497 that early help is where we are supporting children of all ages in a way that improves a family's resilience or outcomes or reduces the chance of a problem getting worse. So there is this increased reference and focus on early help throughout this document that I'm going to just talk about in a moment or two. We've also seen within the document now the inclusion of the statistic that we've known for a while, that children with disabilities are 3 times more likely to be abused than their peers. And then Annex B, remember the bit that all your colleagues are going to read if they've got access to children. Again, we see tweaking of the terminology in reference around criminal exploitation, sexual exploitation, particularly in the list of indicators of county lines. And now we've seen included where children might go missing from school or home or are found in areas away from home, and they've been the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator of serious violence. And so we need to have that consideration around those serious behaviour incidents, around whether or not there's a child protection concern going on. And you think about the reasons why children get expelled, excluded, suspended from schools. It's usually those serious incidents, so serious behaviour incidents, violence, sexualised behaviour, bringing a weapon in, drugs, whatever it may be, those big incidents. Well, actually, you scratch the surface of any of those, very quickly you're at a safeguarding reason for that incident occurring. And so that consideration of the perpetrator's background as well is really important. And then we have got a technical change, just reference to a couple of documents that have been published and updated to support children in the court system. So it seems like minimal changes, but they are quite a significant one. And the first one, as I said, of those, I'll just go into a bit more detail on each of those. The first one is around the definition of safeguarding. And what we can see here, if I just bring up the official definition in keeping children safe now, the text in green has been added this year. So the text in green clearly highlights, well, first of all, now we've got that early help bit of the definition that's even more defined than it was before. Providing help and support to meet the needs of children as soon as problems emerge. So that's really important. If the definition has changed, it's changed for a reason. And therefore, it's really important that our colleagues, in whatever inset training and updates you provide, are really clear about what that really means for them. I'll expand on that in a moment. And then the second change is the expansion of the child protection bit of the definition as well. So we're not only protecting children from maltreatment, as the statement says, but it's also clarified that that could be inside the home, outside the home, including online. And I think it's important to emphasize the online part of this, because with the DfE's recommended mobile phone ban in schools, we know that most education settings don't have mobile phones in schools. And so therefore sometimes, and we work with Brightcore, we work with over 900 schools and colleges nationally. Sometimes we come across schools where there's been an incident, perhaps online at the weekend, and children come into school on a Monday morning and say, so-and-so's been bullying me on Fortnite. And it could be quite tempting to say, well, look, we don't have tech in school. This could be a parental issue potentially. Parents need to deal with this. But actually, if you think about what that disclosure is there, we've got a child disclosing child-on-child abuse. Just because it happens online at the weekend is irrelevant. Think about it from a DSL's perspective. If a child comes into school and says, my parents are doing X, Y, or Z to me at the weekend, we of course would be all over it straight away. So they've just clarified that this can involve harms outside the family home, online, offline, and so on. So it's really important we're clear about that with our colleagues. Now, the two bits I've just highlighted there are where early help sits in the definition of safeguarding. It always sat in that bottom definition, though, that taking action to enable children to have the best outcomes. But now we've got that specific reference to it in that first sentence. So I think it's important to make sure your colleagues are clear about what we mean by early help. Do your colleagues know how your setting provides early help? Do they know what it means? And we do a lot of external friendly pairs of eyes safeguarding reviews for schools. And we talk to governors, we talk to members of staff all the time. And often they're not 100% clear exactly what the term early help means or what that looks like in their settings. So it is really important, particularly now the definition has changed, to emphasize it more, that we're clear and our colleagues are clear about what that looks like on our patch, as it were. So if you look within part 1, the bit that they'll have all read, it does say paragraph 6, all staff should be prepared to identify children who might benefit from early help. And then it means providing support as soon as a problem emerges at any point in a child's life, from the foundation years through to the teenage years. A little bit later on, paragraph 13, it states that all staff should be aware of the local early help process and understand their role in it. So are they clear? Are you clear with them about what their role is in this process? Safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. So what does that mean from an early help perspective for your colleagues? And then, if you remember in part 5, I mentioned it earlier on, we've got that change, again, reference to early help, thinking about or referencing the family role. So it's also improving a family's resilience and outcomes, reduces the chances of problems getting worse. And so it's really important that we do spend a bit of time on this with our colleagues this year, because it's an area that's not as well understood as most of the kind of risks categories that we do training on. And if you look at paragraph 18, it goes through an extensive list of the potential need for early help for certain indicators that your colleagues need to be aware of, and their risk categories. So children with disabilities, children with SEND, children who've got a mental health need, young carers, those showing sign of being drawn into antisocial behavior or criminality, where they're frequently going missing. Those behavior references, again, where they've experienced multiple suspensions or at risk of being permanently excluded. The list goes on as well, where we've got a risk of modern slavery, trafficking or exploitation, where we've got a risk of radicalization, where they've got a parent in custody or there's parental offending going on. If we've got difficult family circumstances such as drug and alcohol misuse or adult mental health issues, domestic abuse, if they're misusing alcohol or drugs themselves, if they're at risk of honor-based abuse such as FGM or forced marriage, and if they're privately fostered as well. Now, that list is there for a reason, and it's important what we see is with these additional vulnerabilities that our colleagues are clear that we're not just waiting for these incidents to occur just because a child may be at risk or vulnerable. We're not waiting for things to deteriorate to it become a child protection concern and then we contact the DSL. What we need to be thinking of is, what does early help look like for these young people? How do we reduce the risk? How do we prevent this deteriorating for these young people or their families? And so, of course, this comes and sits under the DSL's remit, but staff need to be clear not only what they're looking at, what their role entails, and the need to discuss what their thoughts are and those perhaps concerns they might have with the DSL and follow the DSL's advice. Now, a good practice recommendation we make to most of the schools, well, all the schools that we work with, is to publish your early help offer on your website. You know, which agencies do we work with? What does it look like? How do we provide support at the earliest opportunity in our settings? And that comes back to the phrase I've mentioned already that's often used, safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. We know that phrase is used all the time, but not necessarily with a clear and coherent understanding amongst all of our colleagues. It's really important that all staff understand that they have got a responsibility to provide that safe environment as a minimum in which children can learn. That they're particularly important because they're in a position to identify those concerns early and therefore provide help for children at that earliest phase, as well as, of course, preventing those concerns from escalating. We're in such a privileged position in education settings because we know those children so well, better than their parents, sadly, in a lot of cases. We build those amazing relationships which inspire children, help them to learn and go on to be the next generation leading society. We are well placed, therefore, as well, to spot those behaviour changes, to spot those concerns at that early help level. And it's really important, therefore, that colleagues understand their role in this, and it's not just immediately wait for a child protection concern and then refer to the DSL. So when we think about the many, many facets of safeguarding, and I won't read through everything on the screen there, it's really important that all of our colleagues understand that they are themselves doing many things each day to safeguard children. It's not just the role and the remit of the safeguarding and child protection team. Things like taking a register, making sure bags aren't blocking fire exits, that chemicals aren't lying around in science labs, all of that is safeguarding. And it is really crucial that everyone understands that they are themselves doing many things each day to safeguard and protect children. And they are part of this early help process. The key thing they're going to be doing is sharing information as soon as possible. And the idea with early help is we really are sharing that information as soon as possible. As soon as we think, actually, this might help this young person or reduce a risk slightly. We know colleagues need to be proactive in sharing that information. It might be the piece of information the DSL needs, but it's really important in order to help identify, to assess and respond to those risks and concerns. And therefore, they need to understand their responsibility in this. Whether this is the first time we've got a concern about a child ever, or this child is already known to children's social care, it's still important to share that information. Time after time, sadly, with those child safeguarding practice reviews, when children sadly die or are harmed in severe circumstances, we often see failure to share information as something that was highlighted as one of the causal issues in the death or harm of that child. We don't want that to happen on our watch. We know that doing nothing is not an option, and therefore it really is important that we emphasise to our colleagues, safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. And that's never been clearer than the definition of safeguarding that's been included this year. Other changes in part one, just to mention, I did say we've got this change around attendance. Now we've been talking about absence, unexplained absence before, but we've got this real emphasis on persistent absence and the need to think about what that means from a safeguarding perspective. And it's important our colleagues understand that they've got a role to play in this area as well. We know when you look at those, if you look at the profiles of children, if you use CPOMs, My Concern, Safeguard, one of the things we can see is see the bigger picture often with children quite easily on these digital platforms. And often what we see when we become aware of an abuse situation or neglect or exploitation of a child, if you look back in time on that child's profile, generally in the weeks and months before we found out about the child protection incident, we see the attendance flag going up first. And so it's really important, therefore, that we think about that situation or that possibility when you've got children who are persistently absent. Is there a safeguarding incident going on that we don't know about yet? even more so if they're already on our radar as potentially vulnerable. Now, if we look at where this is coming from, if you look at the national attendance data for the last academic year, that persistent absence figure of over 20%, 1 in 5 children missed a minimum of 10% of the school sessions last academic year. Primary, 15.1%, as you can see the bottom line there. Secondary, 26.1%. So it's really important we're starting to think, well, okay, can we think about an early help response to attendance concerns? And this has all come about because of the Working Together to Improve School Attendance document for all education settings, every phase, every context, that was published back in published back in February, came into force on the 19th of August. And so that's why we're seeing increased references to this in Keeping Children Safe. I'm sure you're aware of this document. I'm sure many of you have had to put a number of changes in place as a result of it over the past few months. But we know within this, it does reference very clearly that attendance is part of safeguarding welfare, and therefore it's everyone's responsibility. Each school should have a senior attendance champion. All staff should know who that is. And we know that we're expected to recognise that children missing education can be a vital warning sign, as I said, of neglect, abuse and exploitation, because it often is. If we just look at crime, for example, as well, as neatly illustrated in paragraph 13 of that document, 81% of children who were cautioned for any offence last year were persistently absent at the point of that caution. 85% of children who were cautioned for serious violence offences were persistently absent at that point. So we've got this clear link with attendance and other concerns. And so rightly so, it mentions within that document that we should recognise that absence is a symptom of something. Whatever it's a symptom of is for us to investigate and look into, but something is going on, which means that child's not at school. Even if it's, of course, it's prolonged illness, protracted illness, of course, we need to try and support and respond to that. But often it can be a symptom of something else. So it's part of improving welfare. We know this. So therefore, we've got this increased statutory focus on attendance and links with attainment, behaviour, safeguarding, and so on and so forth. Now, this is not all just coming onto schools. We've got the responsibilities of local authorities as well. And actually, it does say very clearly in that all local authorities are expected to have a strategic approach to attendance now, and to recognise that absence is a symptom, and therefore their frontline services need to be thinking about education and safeguarding links around attendance as well. Because historically, a lot of safeguarding child protection teams in local authorities have said, well, attendance isn't much to do with us. That's now shifted as well, and it's important we understand they've got that increased responsibility as well. If we look at the reasons for persistent absence that we see, if you look at the research over the last few years, we know there's a lot going on. We know children with SEND always had a lower rate of attendance. We know that's increased now. We know the most common reason cited for persistent absence from school is anxiety and mental health concerns. We know that poverty plays a part. We know there's a greater risk of exploitation when children aren't in school. We know that a lot of young carers are missing school. 40% of young carers state that they don't or hardly get much support from their school. Now, that's not a criticism of school. It's because often they don't identify they're a young carer, and therefore we don't know that they've got this additional role at home. We know that children with social workers miss nearly twice the amount of education as everyone else. And we also know we've got a culture, if you look at the research from the Centre for Social Justice, roughly a third of parents in their research from last year felt like their child didn't need to be at school 5 days a week. And that's a bit of a symptom of the hang-up of COVID and working from home. And, well, I'm at home on a Friday, they'll be all right at home on Friday as well. So we've got a breaking of that sort of social contract between parents, or some parents, and schools as well. So there's a lot going on here. And our role from a Keeping Children Safe point of view is to make sure we are considering safeguarding and child protection possible concerns when thinking about attendance. The other change in terminology is around exploitation. If you remember that phrase, or the term exploitation is added now when we're talking about abuse, neglect. So abuse, neglect and exploitation. And we know the definition of criminal exploitation, as I've mentioned already, now says it may involve an exchange for something the victim wants. Now, the reason that's gone in there is because criminal exploitation is the fastest growing safeguarding concern now. We know the National Crime Agency's data suggests there are at least between 6,000 and 8,000 offenders involved in the exploitation of people in the UK. And we've seen an 80% increase in online sexual and criminal exploitation in recent years. This is why it's gone in. We need to be responding to this. We need to be thinking about prevention, early help, rather than waiting to those very tragic consequences when that exploitation occurs. We know the online world isn't helping. 20% of young people have seen online content promoting gang membership, 24% seeing content featuring carrying, using and promoting weapons. And we know end-to-end encryption. We know that because social media companies are not classed as publishers, they're not held accountable for everything that's on their platforms. We know we've got a bit of a problem here in terms of what children are being exposed to. And therefore, there is a clear link. If we look at children who are being exploited, if you look at the data there, you can see, apologies, some of the text seems to have just missed out a little bit on the right-hand side there, but never mind. What we've got here is some of the data up to the last reporting window, looking at the NRM data, the National Referral Mechanism. Now, that's the data where children reported through by various agencies when we believe there is exploitation occurring. And we use the modern slavery legislation to prosecute, to liberate, and so on and so forth. And you can see the purple line at the top there is adults, the grey line at the bottom there is children. And we've seen a significant increase year on year of the number of children who are known to be or highly suspected to be criminally exploited. And we're over that sort of 7,000 mark now. If we look at one specific category of exploitation, county lines, you can see since we started recording the data back in 2017, the largest group by a distance every single year that are exploited in this way are male children. 74% if we look at the 2023 data, although we have made some progress in trying to reduce things from 22 to 23, as you can see there. But this is why it's in the, we're seeing the addition of this in keeping children safe. If we look at the role of technology in terms of recruitment, well, Catch-22, the national charity, you might be fully aware of their amazing work that they do. Johnny Balderson, one of their managers, reported last year that the youngest child they dealt with getting involved in county lines was a 7-year-old. So this is an infant level issue rather than just a primary and prep concern, as it were. We know social media platforms are problematic in terms of their recruitment opportunities. We've seen adverts that are on there just targeting recruitment, talking about things like recruitment opportunities available. We know that the profile has shifted. So we're seeing much younger children being targeted, affluent children being targeted. It's not just playing into the cost of living crisis, although it absolutely is as well. We're also seeing vapes being used as a recruitment tool as well. And you might have seen the story from last summer from the Met Chief being tasked with stopping gangs luring people with vapes. Because actually, why spend £100 or £200 or £500 on a flash pair of trainers or a gift or another phone when you can spend £2 on a vape that's fruit flavoured, all children want? It's the bane of every school's lives at the moment, and it's also full of quite addictive nicotine. So we can see how this kind of plays into the hands a little bit. We've seen girls being forced to take on debts for their boyfriends. We've seen Sweets magazine food being used as well to lure children in. And so it's really important that we're aware of these vulnerabilities. But when you're thinking about the changes to keeping children safe, why has this phrase gone in, or this one term actually, exploitation, gone in? And what do your colleagues need to know about it? Well, it's really important that they're aware of the indicators of exploitation. That's the list that's in Keeping Children Safe. I won't read through it all. The two that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that have been tweaked for this year. But actually, as you're having a look down that list, one of the key things we notice when we're looking at this list is these aren't the things that necessarily make it to the DSL straight away. These aren't the things that straight away get declared as a child protection concern. That change in peer group is a key indicator. 2 phones, that's a big one as well, isn't it? Why does any child really need 2 phones? As well as, of course, what we think of the more obvious gifts, flash gifts, those kind of things. When we look down this list, often these are the kind of signs and symptoms that our colleagues are likely to spot who've got good relationships with those young people. Our colleagues on gate duty, on the quad at break or lunchtime, just talking to those young people. They're the ones who are noticed. Well, actually, so-and-so isn't hanging around with their traditional friendship group anymore. They're talking about another friend outside of school, or they're trying to impress these older students from another school or the same school. Who knows? But Usually what we see is a power imbalance followed by a significant behavioral change. And that kind of stuff isn't the thing. That's not the thing. Those aren't the things that make it to the DSL, as I said straight away. So it's really important that all of our colleagues understand their role in this, that they need to be letting the DSL know these kind of lower level signs and symptoms, the potential need for early help in this regard, so that the DSL can then build the bigger picture. So that's why it's in there. And again, I would recommend making sure you get an update for colleagues in on this area relatively soon in the academic year. I think the key thing for all of our colleagues in each of our settings, and it will be different for each of you, is, are your colleagues clear what the main risks are for children in your school or college? Who are your vulnerable groups? What are your peer influence issues that you've got? What are the risks in your community, your neighbourhood? When we think about the specific context, it's really important that our colleagues are aware of that. Are they aware of the crime statistics in the area? I think that's really important as well, because therefore we should be doing a little bit more training on those kind of things if they are the most prevalent issues, because they're the things we're most likely to spot. We often recommend that in your safeguarding and child protection policy, you have a contextual paragraph talking about the context of your setting, so that it's clear, it's part of what staff read and understand. And of course, doing some training on the local context, I think, is really important as part of your exploitation training. Other changes then, just briefly, part 2, the management of safeguarding. Now I've put an asterisk next to this question, this section on gender questioning, because this was the area that we thought was going to change. So back in May, there was speculation that this would change in the final document in September, because if you clicked on the consultation document around gender questioning that the previous administration published, it even says on it, this was a document belonging to the previous administration. So we thought the new government was going to change this. As it stands, they haven't done. They've just put the guidance in as it was, with a statement at the top that says this is still under review. So there's potential we get another version of Keeping Children Safe later in the year. I think more realistically, it's going to wait until either we get guidance and legislation, or we get the significant changes that we believe are going to happen in September 25. But as it stands, we need to be aware that the phrase gender questioning has replaced the word trans. And therefore that needs to be in our documents, our guidance, and that we need to make sure that we're considering the needs of individuals in partnership with their parents. We're responding to clinical advice, and we're very aware of those vulnerabilities, particularly around bullying for those very vulnerable young people. And then we've also got in part 2 this phrase, which again, I think is really important that colleagues understand what it means and why it's different. So previously, it said it was important for staff to provide a safe space for pupils to disclose and talk. Now this year it says it's important for staff to create a culture where pupils can speak out. Now that seems just like a technical change, but it is a big difference, because what we know is actually often children don't just come up and disclose something. Actually, they really want to make sure they are safe, and therefore we need to be thinking about the culture rather than just that room's safe, that individual is someone you can go and talk to. It's all staff's responsibility to enforce and create that culture. There's a few technical things in there as well, just to bring things in line with other pieces of guidance and legislation. So it very clear within that now that as a school, we are continue to be responsible. If we place a child in alternative provision, we continue to be responsible for their safeguarding provision. There's increased reference to elective home education now, and we know that we're going to see changes, or we believe we're going to see changes and additional requirements on local authorities to address the many children who we don't really know where they are at this point. So technical changes there, absolutely. And there's acknowledgement that many home children have a positive learning experience, but some parents use it a way of dodging the attention of authorities when safeguarding concerns have been raised. So those are technical changes. Parts 3 and 4, so part 3, safer recruitment, part 4, managing allegations, no changes at all to that section. I've talked about part 5 as well. So the last bit is Annex C, your job description as a DSL if you're the DSL. Now the DfE like to change the DSL's job description just slightly every year. Now this year what we've got is quite an important one that we acknowledge as DSLs. Firstly, well, there's two actually. The first one is it clarifies that we know as DSLs we have to make sure that the DSL is always available or a DDSL, but they've clarified that in exceptional circumstances that can include remote availability. Now, bizarrely, the format they've chosen to include is Skype. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I think the last time I used Skype was 2008. Maybe 2010, I don't know. You may still use it all the time. So we use other digital platforms as well, but that's the one they chose to reference. And then the other change, which I think is really important that we're clear on as DSLs, is we know DSLs should keep written records of all concerns. And from a good practice point of view, we're including the rationale of why we've made those decisions. But they've really clarified in there the need to make sure we're including that rationale, including instances where referrals were made, but also crucially where we didn't make a referral. If we've made a decision based on the information that we've got as a DSL to not refer this through to children's social care, we need to write down why we made that decision. It not only helps to accurately provide a picture of where we were at from an evidential point of view, but also it protects you as a DSL. Because we support, as I said, over 900 schools, and regularly we come across incidents where a DSL's made a decision not to refer based on the evidence at the time, and then 3 weeks later, another bit of information, and you think, oh no, it was a child protection concern all along, we should have referred. And so it's really important to say, based on the information at this time, this is why we did or did not refer. And so making sure that rationale is included is really important in the record keeping. So those are the main changes to keeping children safe. Now, as you may be aware or may not, I don't know, we work extensively in the safeguarding and mental health areas. And one of the key things we do with a lot of the schools and colleges we work with is provide them with updates around all the statutory guidance documents from a safeguarding or a mental health and wellbeing point of view. And I think, although I've just talked extensively about keeping children safe and the changes there, if you look at some of the other documents that have come online just in the last 12 months that relate to safeguarding, there's more than ever before. We've got the suspension and permanent exclusion guidance, the after school clubs guidance, Working Together 23, the Children's Social Care National Framework changes in December 23. The Prevent Duty guidance came online in December. The EYFS guidance changed on the 4th of January. We're going to get another version of that imminently, hence the red dot on it. We've got the mobile phones in schools guidance in February. We've got the behaviour in schools guidance that changed in February. We've got the guidance around sharing nudes and semi-nudes that was updated back in April. We've got updated guidance around governance for academy trusts and maintain schools. We got the updated data protection guidance in April. We've got the protective security and preparedness guidance that came out in April. The information sharing guidance in May. The updates to the filtering and monitoring and cybersecurity standards that were updated in May. We got the school and college security guidance in May. We've got Working Together to Improve School Attendance, which I've already talked about. The summary of responsibilities when mental health issues are affecting attendance was about over 12 months ago now, but links to that as well. We've got the inspection handbooks that were last updated in April. They're due to be updated imminently. Then we've got Keeping Children Safe in Education as well. We've got a huge list of documents that all have safeguarding elements. And I know, having been a DSL for many years, it's such a hard job to stay up to date on all of these things. Many of these are hundreds of pages. And so as a DSL, I think it is important that you're clear about what these mean for your role from a safeguarding point of view. One of the areas we help is we provide compliance update webinars and masterclasses for DSLs. If it's an area of interest, we generally do them in a kind of live online format, a bit like this one, where we do sort of 3 hours and there's a lot of discussion, a lot of case studies and going through the documents and what they really mean for DSLs in practice. And so if we can help, please go and have a look at our website. It's brightcoreconsultancy.com. You can see the upcoming courses, the services we do. There's lists of masterclasses on there that we do. You can book onto any of those, and we subsidise those for education settings as well. So have a look. I'm sure there might be something of interest to you there. So just to recap, just to go back to the key documents and requirements, please make sure that all of your colleagues have read and understood Part 1 and Annex B. If they've got access to children, make sure the senior team and governors have also read Part 2 and Annex C as a minimum. Make sure the policy's been updated in line with KCSIE, and make sure your colleagues have read and understood your staff behaviour policy and code of conduct. And there we go, everybody. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be able to speak to you. I'm going to hand back to Alicia at this point, see if we've got any questions or what you'd like to say.